Everyone. Before we get started, I would like everyone to take an opportunity to just type in and let us know that you can hear me and or see the slides on your screen so that we know that we are on the same page. So if you would take a few minutes to just say, yes, I can hear you, no, I can't see the screen, so that before we get started, we can deal with all the technical pieces so that we have a smooth webinar. There will be about a 30 seconds delay because we are working in two different rooms. So I have to give a few minutes for our tech person to come in. So thank you for your attendance. I look forward to the hour of sharing with you. Today we're going to focus on the relationship between the executive director and the board. We're not talking about personalities here. We're talking about documentation, transparency, how you communicate in different structure, different type of boards, how the responsibility is shared between the executive director and the board. So welcome. At any point, please feel free to type questions, and I will do my best to answer them today. If not, please join me on Thursday between 10 and 11, where I will deal with all of the questions that weren't dealt with today or any other questions that may come up in the interim. This is the third of 6 sessions on governance. So previously there's been a lot of work done, peer learning on governance. So please check on the OrgWise website, especially on the forum, for some of the questions that may come up today or stuff that has been already dealt with. So I encourage you to check the website at www.orgwise.ca forum. Again, on Thursday, July 18th, we will be doing the Q&A from 10 to 11. So let's get started today. What is the objective of today's session? To basically look at the communication between the executive director and the board, to look at how communication may differ depending on the type of board or model of board that you're operating under, best practice, and very important pieces, the power dynamics between the chair of the board and the executive director. Depending on the type of structure you have, sometimes those two run into conflict because the job description of the executive director or the job description of the chair of the board is not clearly defined. So we're going to look at specific models and how the power dynamics may play itself out in relation to those structures. We're also going to look at the benefits to an organization to have good communication, proper infrastructure via the job description of the executive director, roles and responsibility of the executive director in relations to how they relate to the board. I think it's one of the most important and most crucial relationship that any board can have is how they actually interact with the ED of any organization or the lead manager or team leader, whatever the title may be. Because that is the person who is in the day-to-day function of the organization. They are the ear to the issues within the community, the ear to the issues within the organization, as well as all the stakeholders that are involved in whether it's funding or other issues. So it is imperative that that relationship is fluid, that it's clearly understood. So I noticed that of the registrant today, we have a good cross-section of executive director and board members, and I look forward to interacting and hearing from you based on the roles that you currently hold and your communication or your interaction with your boards and how fluid that may be. Documentation, I think, is the hardest piece because I, as a chair of many boards in the past, have had some incredible executive director relationship where, the board seemed to run itself without really a lot of work from me, and I can truly say it was an end result of good communication and documentation from the executive director. There was never any surprises. I was given the opportunity to know of issues way ahead of board meetings so that I could, do my own research and kind of upgrade my knowledge on issues. So again, I cannot stress enough how important that role ends up being to the growth and success of an organization. So who do I report to? When we look at the executive director, when we look at the board, and when we look at the staff. This little chart here is a quick breakdown of how I saw the reporting or the communication. So the staff and volunteers basically on a day-to-day basis are interacting with the executive director. The executive director is hired by the board to oversee the operational pieces and implement the procedures, standards that is developed on behalf of the organization by the board. The board communicates clear, concise standards, policies, procedures, and they ensure that operation within the organization via the policies are always in keeping with the bylaws that has been developed for the governance of the organization. Very important that the board understands the bylaws that they're operating in, because under the bylaws or in the bylaws there are clear tools of how you communicate with the executive director and the type of relationship that should be had. So I'm hoping that the executive directors who are participating today, as well as the board members, this is something that you've spent a lot of time is understanding your bylaws and the pieces in communication with the executive director role. Again, the staff's role is about delivery and services. That doesn't say that the staff never has interaction with the board, and I think any good board, when they're first doing their orientation, spends a little bit of time kind of knowing who the faces are around the organization. The executive director usually sets the tone of giving the education about who the community partners are, who are the funders, what are the expectations. That's also the role of the board, and I think this is where it gets a little tricky, because the understanding of the function of the organization is as equally important to the board as it is the executive director. The board's job is to make sure that they put those roles, responsibility in place to make sure that the executive director has an easy time of their job. The staff is to identify what are the trends, what are the needs of the community, take that to the executive director so that she or he can form it in a way to the board so that they can develop new standards to help implement any changes. So this chart here was just a simple breakdown of what I perceive the roles and responsibility of staff, volunteer, executive director, and boards are in the fluid running of the day-to-day operation, as well as the growth of any nonprofit organization. So at this time, if you have any questions or you want to make any comment, I would appreciate you typing it into the box on the right-hand side, and I will do my best again to try and answer them. So when we talk about the executive director, who is that person? What are their roles? Basically, that person has the responsibility of ensuring that the board understands their role, understands the historical piece of the organization. Because in that relationship, what may happen is the board may change, but the executive director may not. So that person holds, in a lot of organizations, the historical piece. So as a new board chair or as a new board, you should be going to the executive director to find out where you can get the information about the historical piece. That person also provides feedback when you're doing recruitment of new board members of what the deficits are within the organization. So when you're looking for new board members, you can say, okay, this is what we need because this is where the organization is now going, right? So it is very important that we understand that. the other thing is the executive responsibilities determine which board you operate. So if you are a collective, the role of the executive director will be very different than if you're a policy board. And the next couple of slides, we're going to spend some time looking at the different structure of boards, the reporting or the communication that should happen between the executive director or may be happening. And I would be interested to hear from the people that are currently on, which models are you operating with and the level of success that you're having with your governance model based on that particular model. Okay, so if you are in an operational board, the board, basically it means the board manages. They govern and perform the work of the organization. So in this situation, if you're an operational board, there isn't really a clear divide between the executive director and the board. The executive director is a staff and report to the board, as do all the other staff. The operational part of the day-to-day piece is assumed by the executive director, but the board determines a lot of how that will happen. They have more of less hands-off and more involvement. So this has limited power for the executive director in the sense that every decision that is made in conjunction with the board of directors. The board is in control of the day-to-day operation. Some operational boards run really well in this model, so it depends again on the community that you serve, the type of industry you're involved with. So where this model may work really well, say in rural Ontario, it may not in the GTA area, or where it may work really well for a school, it may not work as effectively for a, say, shelter base. So the operational model that you pick determines the type of role the executive and the function of the executive director and the power that that person also has. And while you're trying to understand it, it's important that the infrastructure or the pieces that support those positions are clearly defined. So if you have an operational piece and the executive director's role is limited, then it needs to be clearly outlined in his or her job duty exactly what her or his functions are, so that there isn't miscommunication and misunderstanding. So in this model, I think you would have to have boards who are very, very clear of the issues in the community, understands the day-to-day operation of the organization, because they're acting as managers, they're acting as an extension of the executive director in the decision-making arena. So this is one of the most contentious type of models out there because of the role that the board has, and they have more of a controlling role than the executive director. In the model of a collective, everyone has equal voice, so they operate as the board and the staff operate as a single team. When decisions are made, we tend to do the everyone has equal voice. The decision is not made until all voices are heard. This model, the patience, I would say, is the most important part in a collective board, because the communication piece, you spend a lot of time ensuring that there's buy-in from everyone around the table. The person who is in the leadership role may not have the same responsibility as someone in an operational board. So you have equal power. There's no distinction between the executive director and the staff. Most collectives do not have an executive director, and if they do, it's entitled only. The role of the executive director or the lead staff would be to communicate the historical piece, to help prepare the annual report. So there is someone who may take on that lead role. In the bylaws of your organization, if this is your model, then you would have clear duties and understanding of how that is communicated and how that is done. So the power is shared. It's a balance between the board, the executive director, and the staff. So this is one of the models where staff actually has equal say in the day-to-day operation, the day-to-day design of policies and procedures. I've sat in a few collectives in my time, and one thing that I found that was really good is the smaller the organization, the easier it is for collectives model to operate. That's been my experience. I found that once we got into over 50 staff, then it became a little bit more difficult to have this model. Because if you're doing inclusion, and inclusion in the true sense, where everyone's voice is heard, then you end up having to develop a lot of subcommittee to get work done, because the discussion process can sometimes seem very daunting and on-ending. So in the collective model, where the shared power of the board and the executive director is the model that is being used, it's crucial that you have people in the role that is able to deal with consensus decision, because this is the piece that collectives really will work with, is consensus decision. So any questions at this time? Please feel free again to let me know. Management model. So in this model, the board manages the operations through committees that may or may not have staff coordinator or staff sitting on it. In this particular role, the ED might be the senior staff rather than an executive director. There might be committees that assumes individual roles. The executive committee, for instance, may assume the duties of the executive director. So the power is distributed between staff and board. This one, again, all of these models, communication is the key. Communication between the staff, communication between the board, communication with the funders. It's the key to clear understanding of where do you draw the line between who makes decision on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's the piece that, when all is said and done, is that how are decisions made on a daily basis? Who signs off on what? And where are those roles defined? So the bylaws are very important, and usually the treasurer or the secretary ensures that we are following the bylaws as you do operational daily pieces at each board member, that your board meeting, that you're actually following the bylaws to ensure that the model and the communication piece are in place. So this is the management piece. I'm sure there are some people on the panel today who are members of a management, and I hope that you have that clear understanding of how the power between your staff and the board are executed on a day-to-day basis. This one I have not had a lot of dealing with, and I think it's more when you're dealing with political parties that tend to have this, or the corporate sector. And it is elected, so the role is a little bit more clearly defined. With the electoral body, there are laws that govern how you operate more so. Not saying that the other models do not have laws, but I think the public laws on this particular model is a little bit more clearly defined. Historically, it's been more defined than, say, some of the other models in, for instance, like a collective, may not have developed the same way as this particular model. So when you're looking at it, is in the best interest of the community, it's the best interest of the people who elected that person into their position, and that person is then accountable to the constituents, right? It's not only about whether you follow protocol, but you're accountable to the bigger community, and they can hold you accountable. So you assume the leadership. You operate through guidance. The constituents are elected by you're elected through the office, and the office manages and governs how you make decisions. Your primary responsibility is about ensuring that whatever laws, the legality within that organization is upheld. It's defined a little bit different, and as I was saying to you, there's the Corporate Act for if you're a board, you can go and say, this is how the bylaws are defined. This is an area that it's much clearer, and I think sometimes this model ends up having less difficulty about the communication because there have been so much invested in the governance piece around how the person, the leader, execute their roles. So this is the model that I think potentially may have less difficulty defining their roles because there are more clear defined laws about you can and cannot do. Whereas some of the other ones, there are some gray areas that the bylaws may not have defined. So as an end result, the communication doesn't happen as fluid as we would like. Again, feel free to pose questions to me or to challenge some of the stuff that I've said. I'm always open to learning, and some of these board models I have more experience with than others, and I'm bringing to you another perspective. You as a board member and as an executive director may have a different rapport in your individual organization, and as long as it's meeting the mandate and the missions of your organization, then the pieces that I'm saying is to help enhance what you already have in place. To challenge you to say, are you doing what's your mandate, what's your vision, what your bylaws dictate, and is your communication in keeping with that particular tenors. So in a traditional model, the board governs, they oversee the operation through committee. They use committees, so finance committee, human resource committee, to basically come up with leadership models and leadership standards. There's a question around, I can hear the facility. Okay. Any questions? Thank you. I think right now if you just give us 30 seconds, it's showing that we're having a little bit of difficulties. So I just want to make sure that, can everyone tell me that you are still able to hear me? Can I just have a, yes, you're able to hear me? So I'm assuming that that's not a problem, that everyone can still hear me and you can still see the slides. Okay? So we were talking again about the traditional board model and how the functions that the executive director has in a traditional board model. And the response, hold on. One of the difficulties we have with slides and technology is that sometimes they don't always do what we want them to do. So as an end result, I'm sure right now the slide is being covered by the, hold on. Give me a minute, please. Oh, there we go. The responsibility for the day-to-day activity and the management of the staff and volunteer to ensure that the volunteers and staff are managed and they know their roles and responsibility, that the organization meets its legal responsibility obligation, and that they adhere to the vision and mission of the organization. The power lines within this position, it's a sharing, it's more of a sharing relationship. The executive director does take on a leadership role, but it's in consultation again with the chair of the board. And I think the traditional model is where the chair of the board works closely with the executive director to understand the day-to-day challenge and make sure that when the board meets that they are able to deal with issues on a basis that gets the work done. So that power line between the executive director and the board is not as strict. I think at any point you in this model will have where a chair of the board could call the executive director and say, based on the issues from the last board meeting, what are your current need, and how do I ensure that the meeting is facilitated so that we are, exactly where you need us to be. So it's working in conjunction with the executive director to ensure that the missions and values and the legal obligations are upheld on a day-to-day basis. I think this one is also very clear, right? The power lines is very clearly defined. The board has the responsibility for the legal obligation. Their job is to make sure that the executive director has all the things that he or she needs to manage the staff and volunteer. Result-based board. This is always an interesting one because the executive director is not a voted member of the board, does have a lot of influence over the policy, is viewed as a full partner with the board, also dictates a lot of what are the committees and what's the need for the committees. So the executive director in this particular model gives a lot of guidance to the board. The board basically monitors and they audit and they make sure that the checks and balances are in place, but the running of the organization, I think, falls in the hands of the executive director. Although he or she may not be a voted member, they still have a lot of influence about what policies are made, what standards are needed, and how they're carried out within the organization. So as I said, it's an equal partnership with the board. They direct and guide the policy development and ensure that once the policies have been developed that they're implemented, because there's nothing worse than, you're spending a couple of weeks developing policies for operations and it basically just sits on the shelf. I mean, an organization is only as good and as effective as how they implement the policies that are developed. And the revision of standards as program changes, the board and the executive director has to ensure that the standards meets the new needs of the organization. So in this role, it's the executive director's job to ensure that the board is aware of what standards that are needed and help them to develop it to have a fluid operation on a day-to-day basis. So there's no more power, like the board doesn't have any more power than the executive director in this particular model. But the piece that I need to outline here is that the executive director in this particular model drives the policy and ensures that when they're looking for new board members, that the board members are able to fit into this particular model. Because if you do not have the type of personality where you can work in conjunction with the executive director and allowing the executive director to dictate how or what policies are determined, then this particular model may not be the area you want to volunteer in. At this time again, are there any questions, any clarification needed? I'll keep going then. Then the other model is a policy board, and we hear this often. The Carver model, in the 60s, this was a big, 50s and 60s. Most boards operated through this model. The board governs the policies and establish organizational aims, so they are developing the mission, the guidelines. Their management roles are fairly limited. So the definition speaks for itself. The executive director has the freedom to determine, how these goals and objectives are used on a day-to-day basis or followed. So in a policy board, the executive director, it's like how the day-to-day operation is done, it's conducted. He or she ensures that policies and operational standards are in place, and if they're not in place, goes back to the board and says, this is what we need. Again, ask for resources, ask for support, ask for the pieces that helps the board to be stronger, the organization to be stronger, especially when you're looking at stuff around new programs and new undertaking to ensure that the new policies fit with the new undertaking. In the times that we're in right now, where funding have changed and different players are at the table, as a policy board, it's crucial that you revisit the old policies and make sure that they fit with the modern, the updated programs that you are running. There's nothing worse than you've taken on a new program and the program is very successful, but you haven't spent the same time to make sure that the new policies are in place to govern that program or to govern the new growth within the organization. Because it comes back again to the documentation. The history of an organization lies within the minutes that a board, or the minutes that, and the communication between the executive director, the board, and the staff. So without those documentation and without that relationship and fluid communication, it's very hard to have historical pieces of where you started, where you're at, and where you're going. An organization falls short a lot of times by the communication and the documentation that they have in the day-to-day communication between these two players, the board and the executive director. So if you are a policy board and you haven't yet developed the resources around management, this is a good time for you to step back and say, okay, how do we use the role with the executive director to ensure that we have those policies to ensure that the management is exactly where it should be on any given day? The power within this position, again, it drives the action and direction of growth. So the person in the lead role here is aware of the trends in the community. They're aware of what kind of deficits exist within the organization, whether it be the staffing complement. And they bring forth those issues to the board and say, okay, we may need to go after more funding. We may need to change program stream, especially when funders dictate changes within operational daily standards. This is where the communication is very important, because this person helps the board to understand those changes that are happening on a day-to-day basis. So again, if you have not done so, please, take some time with your board chairs to ensure that they have a clear understanding of the model they're operating, their job description, and the correlation between their job description and the executive director's job description. I found my time and the boards that I sat on, it was very, very important to me to have a job description so that I could understand my roles and responsibility. And through my roles and responsibility, I knew what was expected of me. So it was easier for when I sat at board meetings, I could come prepared because I knew exactly what was expected of me. If you're going to take on the role of a policy board and you're not into doing research, or you're not into learning, or you're not into the type of in consultation where you are being asked to go and find policy to do research, then this model may not work for you, as well as one of the other models. The advisory board, again, selected and nominated by the executive director. This board is, this one is a little bit interesting to me, because they have the role of being an advisor to the executive director. So they rubber stamp the decisions that the executive director makes. Very interesting piece here, because I think if you're not clear about what you're rubber stamping and you're not clear of the issues, then legality, the legal pieces here is when board members run into difficulties. And of all the board models, this one is the most crucial to me, that the board understands exactly what it is that the executive director is doing on a day-to-day basis. So the power that he or she may have, the decisions that he or she may have, when those decisions are made, how informed are you? How is it communicated? How is it documented? Because again, as a board member, even though you're in an advisory position, you're still legally responsible for the decisions that are made. So when you are the advisor to the executive director and they're making recommendation, be clear and understand those recommendations. Don't just sign without first having a clear understanding, and the only way that clear understanding can happen is through communication with the person who is sitting as the lead or the executive director in an advisory board. As a board member, you truly need to have your ears to everything that's happening around the organization. So this is one of the models where I think if you are the chair of the board, you really have to do an incredible job of sharing the information with the other members at large. So your job is to understand everything that's happening so that when you are asking the board to make decision or you're having meetings where things are timely, you really need to understand those recommendations. So it's not just about the executive director comes in and he or she says, this is what we're going to do. And yes, you're rubber stamping it because you're hoping that the person that's in that position, you know, holds the integrity of the organization, is honorable, and all of those things that makes you the board that you are, makes you that strong organization. But it is very, very important that you monitor the power that the executive director has, because again, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I'm not saying that people who hold the role of advisory boards are corrupt, but I'm saying without monitoring and without accountability, it's easy for that power to be misused. So it's important that the executive director has clear parameter of that power and how it is used in the day-to-day operation of the organization, and how it's also used when recommendation about the growth policies or undertaking of the organization is brought to the table. I think this would require a very clear, concise thinker as the chair of a board. This would also require the type of executive director where ego and power doesn't play into how they operate, because this is the one place where it's easy for issues to run amok without proper monitoring. So it's important that this has clear, I can't stress it enough, clear guidelines, clear boundaries, clear understanding that the board is, although rubber stamping decisions and recommendation, but they spend the time to know what it is that they're making recommendations on, that they understand, you know, every piece of paper that goes out, that it's documented, that it's available, that it's transparent. Because when all is said and done, you are accountable for everything you sign. So best practice when we look at that is, again, one of the things I've said a lot today is communication. The key to any of these roles is the communication that is held between the executive director and the board. And the communication, not just in the verbal communication, but in the written communication and the documentation of it. I've sat on boards where we've had meetings and there hasn't been any minutes kept of the meetings. At the end of the year, when we're trying to figure out how decisions were made, there's no documentation, or we spend so much time going over unnecessary discussion because there wasn't an agenda, because the person who were in the role of leadership allowed the meetings to take, you know, directions that wasn't in the best interest of the organization. So it's important that the communication that you have is in keeping with the strategic plan that the organization sets at the beginning of the new electoral process of any board. So at the end of the year, you have a new board. The executive director usually works very close with the chair of the board and the recruiting committee, because they're the ones who knows, again, the issues that are going on. And you're trying to elect people within the roles that meets deficits or fills voids of people leaving. You want to make sure that the prior communication is able to be passed on to the new members, and the person that may have that, again, is the executive director. So it's important that we have fluid communication. We have the strategic plan process and communication crucial to the success of any organization. And I think the communication as well should fall in the form of a business plan. You know, how are we going to do work? And when we look at the work, the parameters that governs that work, and revisiting every new board the roles and responsibility of the executive director. I think we fall short in this particular area many times, that we have new chairs, we have new executive director, and we do the status quo rather than saying, okay, the first couple of meetings we need to ensure that everyone is on board of how things happen. You know, that everyone understands the bylaw, they all understand the mission, they all understand the role of the executive director, they understand the model of operation, so that you don't run into issues later on around whose job is it, who do I report to, how are decisions made. And if you spend the time at the beginning of any new board, and in the upcoming session we talk about orientation and recruitment, and I'm going to go a little bit more in details into how do you recruit board members, how do you keep them, and how do you ensure that the new board members are able to fit in and continue the growth. And it comes back again to the communication that you have between the chair, the executive director, and the board will determine the growth within any organization. And if the executive director and the board chair spends a lot of time where they don't agree, it slows the process down. So it's important that the person who is in those two roles have the type of rapport that allows for challenging of ideas, respect for each other, distinct characteristics around equality, inclusion. So all of that falls into communication, of how you communicate. Because if you do not have the piece of your own bias in place when you're communicating, when you're evaluating, because the board also is responsible for evaluating the executive director on an annual basis to give feedbacks of whether they are meeting, you know, their duties, if they're falling short. And it takes a very special relationship to be able to work on a day-to-day basis depending on the model you have, and then turn around and give critiques. The critique is about the organizational goals and mission. It's not about whether you like the person, but it's about how effective they are in their individual roles. Again, any questions I would love to have. Working with the board. The executive director provides the board with relevant materials before each meeting, explains that material before the meeting, so any supplementary stuff that is required will be sent out to the chair. The chair or the board leader will then disseminate that to the secretary, who then ensures that each member at large has the information. The member also has a specific agenda based on the needs of the organization or issues that the executive director has to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and they make sure that those issues are dealt with at each meeting. 3-hour meetings and you do not achieve the stuff for the agenda, basically you need to look at the leadership, because at the end of any meeting, if you have an agenda and you're not following those agenda, why do you have the agenda and why is that person sitting in that role? I'm very, very mindful of people's time, and when I've sat in the role of the chair of boards, if I say a meeting is 3 hours, it is 3 hours. Try not to table stuff, and if you do that, you do revisit it the next meeting, and it's documented. When you don't know what the issues are, I would spend time with the executive director before the meeting, you know, quick email, quick phone call, to ask for clarification, so that I, in the role of the chair of a board, was able to facilitate a smooth discussion so that I could get through the agenda items. There's nothing worse than 3 hours later and you're still on item number 1. That's a waste of everyone's time. So if that's currently the case in your meetings, then you, the executive director, the chair of the board, need to sit and look a little bit of how do you facilitate agenda items meeting, and some training might need to go into how that happens. The group process, again, facilitate discussion to make sure that you stay focused. I remember sitting on a board and we would start off talking about funding, and 3 hours later we still wouldn't have gotten to the issue, and it was very frustrating, and as an end result we lost a lot of board members, because at the end of the day, if I'm giving you 3 or 5 hours a week, I want to know that you're actually using that. So again, it's guiding the process to ensure that when you're having discussion about issues, that everybody's involved, and you know what's required of you. If you don't know what is required of you, then you cannot fully participate in the process. So I have a question from a member here. Do you have a sample of board, the job description of a board? I actually will put this on the forum. Right now I don't have it, but I will post it on the forum on Thursday. So if you want to check back on Thursday, I will make sure that the job description of sample of board's job description, especially around policy board, is posted there, as well as the executive director. Another one was, what are your thoughts as the strengths? The terms of board of director, should they have a finite time on the board, or should they be left open? 20 years as a chair is too long. You're not helping an organization grow. 2 to 5 years, more than enough. I think you need to have new blood. I think you need to have members who are fresh, who are committed, and I know myself, after having sat on collective board policy boards, that after my 2-year term I was tired. I no longer had the same passion and energy as I did at the beginning, and I was quite happy to step down at the end, knowing that I did a good job in the 2 years that I was there, because I know had I stayed for 3 or 4 years, I would have been ineffective. So in some areas, because of the type of work that you do, it's not as easy to get people to volunteer. But if you're doing the recruitment on a yearly basis, where you're constantly looking for board member, I think you will have the leadership that you need. But I do not think that a board member should have the lifetime of the organization. I think you need to have new blood, you need to have new visions, and as policy are changing, so are program. So sometimes you have to actually change the members around. The end of year evaluation that you do for your organization will determine whether or not you need to actually look at changing your board members. So your strategic plan at the beginning of the year said, in the year or 2 years, this is what you're going to achieve. If you haven't achieved it within that timeline, you need to look at the structure of the board and say, is the deficit at the board level? Is it at the executive director level? We are the loss of knowledge. Again, the documentation. I think minutes are key to continuation of issues, because if I voted on something in September, the board turns over in October. The first thing that new chair or the person who is sitting in the vice chair role, that would be the most logical promotion to chair, because that person has sat for a year in the role of vice chair. They have participated in the discussion, and if the executive director term is not up, that person has a lot of the information or the history of the organization. Having said that, I don't want to inundate the executive director with being the only place or the only person that can give a historical piece. So it becomes very important that you document every vote. Who made the vote? What are the decisions? What are the recommendations? Before the board members leave, there should be a report that says these are the outstanding issues that needed to be dealt with. If there were any suit brought against the organization, it becomes important that you also have those issues documented. Because I, as a new board member, I want to know, what am I getting into? So that documentation becomes important to the survival of your organization, because you don't want to be reinventing the wheel every single new board. I mean, there should be overlap. So if it's a 2-year term, you have people leaving at the year mark. So there's always going to be an overlap of some old and new. You should never have your entire board turnover at once. You should never have that. Because if you have that, basically the hit the ground running for the new board members may not happen in the time that the executive director and the staff needs decision, because you're going to need 2 to 3 months to come up to par with what has happened before you've taken on that role. And you do not want to overwhelm your executive director by having that person to have to be the educator for 20 new board members. So it's important that if you have 2-year terms, that on the 2nd year rotation is when you're looking at bringing in. If you have 5-year terms, that at the 2.5-year mark, you're starting to look at who's going to be leaving, what are the new positions we're going to need. But I truly believe that no person should be on a board for more than 1 term. You could go away and come back, but you shouldn't sit for 10, 15, 20 years. Yeah, no, it's just not a good practice for an organization, because you become stale, and once you become stale, you become obsolete. And we know of a lot of organizations and a lot of agencies in the communities where their doors are closing because they have become stale, they've become obsolete, they haven't changed with the time, and they have not adopted policies, practice, standards according to the new requirement that is asked of them. Does one have a limit for a board member? There's a question that I don't fully understand, so I'm going to do a little bit of research on that question, and I will post the answer on the forum on Thursday. I think it has something to do with limit for board members, and I think it's specific to an organization, and I need to do a little bit more research on it before I give you that answer. I think most organization has a 2-year term, and I've only sat on 1 board where my term was past 2 years, and I can say to you that heading into the 3rd year, I was tired, I needed a break, and I was quite happy when it was done. It didn't mean that I was not passionate about the work, but if you're meeting 2 or 3 times a month and you are wanting to stay abreast of the information, the changes, it is your responsibility to understand your role as a board member. It's to understand the piece of how you communicate and how you support the executive director. Policy writing, standard writing, procedural evaluation is taxing, it's time consuming. And if you're an effective board, you should be evaluating the job of the executive director annually. You should also be evaluating the job of your board member annually. And if you have board members who are around the table and they're not pulling their weight at the end of the term, why would you want to renew that position? You know, sometimes it's better to go with a shorter term and achieve the goals and mission than to have a longer term where you become stagnant. So again, I would like to thank you very much for your participation. Okay, the question was around the Ontario Nonprofit Act, and as I said before, I'm going to post it on the forum on Thursday, which is on the 18th, around the limit for board members. It does define it, and it gives you suggestions. Each organization takes the act and they kind of augment it to fit the needs of their organization. So even though the standards may members for 2 years, again, it depends on the type of organization that you operate. important is that if you do change it based on the standards that are set out, that you have clear definition, clear roles, clear responsibility about the term, how the historical information is going to go from one year to the other, how do you stay fresh, and how do you ensure that as changes happen in the organization is able to deal with those changes and ensure that the community doesn't suffer by having a loss of a program or loss of a valuable resource in the community. Because for a lot of community and a lot of newcomers, these organizations are their lifeline. And if the board and the executive director are not working in conjunction to ensure that, you know, changes are dealt with in a timely manner via the procedures, standards, then what happens is you become obsolete. And when you become obsolete, it's a gap in service for the community. So again, I thank you, and I look forward to seeing you on the forum on Thursday. The next session on July 23rd will deal with recruitment of boards, where we'll talk a lot more about how do you keep board members. When you're looking for board members, what characters are you looking for, and how do you do the evaluation process in the recruitment so that you get exactly what is needed for the organization. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for your questions, and I look forward to more of them on Thursday.